Good afternoon. Welcome to Tartan Talks, Monmouth's alumni webinar series. I'm Rachel Evans, Associate Director of Alumni Relations, and I'm so glad you're all able to join us from all over the country, hopefully safe within your own offices or homes. A few logistical notes before I turn the floor over to our presenter. This webinar will be recorded and available for later listening. If you'd like to submit a question during the presentation, please submit it in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. If your Q&A box is not showing, you may need to open it by using the navigation bubbles at the bottom of your screen. Now on to the presentation. When Jake McLean, class of 2015, was a Monmouth College student, he took advantage of numerous leadership opportunities. While on staff at Monmouth, Jake completed his master's degree in organizational leadership at St. Ambrose University. Since August 2015, this alumnus has served in a couple different roles at the college and currently serves as the Assistant Director of Leadership Development and Service for the Wackerly Center for Career, Leadership, and Fellowships, where, among other responsibilities, he coordinates the college's premier leadership and scholarship program, the James and Sybil Stockdale Fellows Program. Let's welcome Jake McLean.
Hello, everybody. Hope everybody can hear me. I've been playing with my mic the entire time I've been waiting for us to start. So, Rachel, I'm still coming in okay?
Yep, you sound good to me.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. Today, everybody, we're going to get started talking about why personality type matters at work. I promise that I'm going to keep this as interactive as possible. So no one's snoozing at their desk while watching this webinar. I think we've all been there a couple of times maybe. So a little bit about me. As Rachel said, I graduated from Monmouth in 2015. I was a communication studies major after changing my major about 9 or 10 times. I got my master's in organizational leadership at St. Ambrose University. When I started on staff, a couple of months after I started, I went for my MBTI certification. So I am officially the MBTI guy on campus and now serve as the Assistant Director of Leadership Development and Service. So today we are going to try to summarize the theory underlying the MBTI assessment and the meaning of personality preferences. And hopefully, by the time we are done, you have an idea of your 4-letter type and how you can apply that type information to your teamwork. And so we'll do some reflection and some short activities and walk you through the starting framework for an action plan. The personality type that makes up the MBTI personality assessment comes from the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who in the 1920s started or published works related to personality type and psychology. And so when we think about personality and differentiating it from behavior, personality, the innate ways we think, feel, and act on most occasions, the inborn characteristics that are enduring. And our personality makes up the core of who we are. Whereas behavior is observable acts and the result of a complex mix of factors like your environment and just things going on around you. So Carl Jung's theory of personality type, he observed that everyone uses 2 kinds of mental processes. There's the first, taking in and gathering information, and making decisions and coming to conclusions about that information. And he asserted that everyone has a preferred way of using these mental processes. He also observed that we live in 2 different worlds. There's the outer world of people, things, and activities, and the inner world of our own ideas, thoughts, and observations. Everyone has a preference for and is typically energized by either the outer world or the inner world. And so he stated that preferences are innate or inborn predispositions for doing things a certain way. He also recognized that preferences are shaped by environmental influences such as your family, your culture, education, and the work that you do. So the MBTI theory then builds on and expands upon Jung's theory. It describes four pairs of opposite preferences, like our right and left hands. We all use both preferences in each pair, but we use one more than the other. The MBTI assessment is designed to indicate our inborn preferences. But it's important to know that the MBTI does not tell you what your personality is. The assessment tool is used to tell you what your preferences are. And so the only person who can say what your personality type is you. And so for just a quick short activity here, if you have a piece of paper handy, it might be useful to keep that nearby and a pen. So I'll give you just a couple minutes to gather that if you don't already. So just like our right and left hands, we have preferences, right? So using your dominant hand, I want you to sign your name. And when we ask college students to do this, the questions I ask them right after is, how did that make you feel? But since you're all muted, I'll just give you their answers. So we don't even really think about it when we sign our name with our dominant hand. It's just something that happens. You're like me or my dad. It looks like a bunch of scribbles. You can't even read your name. But now try signing your name with your non-dominant hand. Do it just right underneath. And then when you look at the two side by side, top to bottom, however you signed your name, the differences are sometimes striking. Sometimes people are ambidextrous and they're showing off from the other side of their screen. But if you are like me, it took you considerably longer to write your or sign your name with your non-dominant hand. It looks like maybe you were back in kindergarten trying to sign your name. And so it's uncomfortable. We have to think about it a little longer. It's not within our preference. And so just to reiterate the preferences. So the MBTI framework talks about these different preference pairs and what they mean. And so if we look at each pair, we look at extroversion or introversion, opposite ways to direct and receive your energy. Sensing or intuition, S or N, opposite ways to take in information. Thinking or feeling, opposite ways to decide and come to conclusions. And judging or perceiving, opposite ways to approach the outside world. And so when we look at these, a lot of times we like to stereotype personality preferences. And so we see that a lot right now with everything going on with COVID-19 and extroversion or introversion. There's a bunch of memes and Facebook, Twitter posts about introverts living their best life now that things are in quarantine mode. And so that's not always necessarily the way we think about it from an MBTI framework, but it is certainly one piece of it. It's just not the whole thing. And so what we're going to do now, I'm going to walk you through some of the characteristics associated with each preference so that we can get your four-letter type. And then I'll read some characteristics of each type when you can let me know what your type is. And so we'll get started now with how people direct and receive their energy. And it's either done, like I said, with a preference for extroversion, E, or introversion, I. People who have a preference for extroversion are energized by interacting with other people. They're sociable and expressive. They prefer to communicate by talking, and they work out their ideas by talking them through, very external processors. But on the other side of that, people who have a preference for introversion are energized by the opportunity to reflect. They're private, they're contained, and they prefer to communicate in writing. And they work out their ideas by reflecting on them. A little more, people who have a preference for extroversion have broad interest in many things. They learn best through doing something, through a hands-on activity, or discussing it with other people. They readily take initiative in work and relationships. And finally, people who have a preference for introversion then focus in depth on a few things. They learn best by reflection or their own mental practice, and they take initiative selectively when the situation or issue is very important to them. So based off of those two descriptions, write a letter that you think best represents you, either extroversion or introversion, E or I. There's going to be a lot of times during our time together today that I ask you to make a forced choice about something. You might be thinking to yourself, oh, I could see myself in either category, but you have a preference for one over the other. And so as we go through these, there's no right or wrong answer here. So go with the one that you feel best kind of represents you. And another important clarification, while we're talking about why personality matters at work, it's important that you consider your personality type as you are as just a regular human being. So you don't have to think about this in the context of your work. Okay, E or I done. Next, how people take in information. It's either done through a preference for sensing or a preference for intuition, S or N. So people who have a preference for sensing focus on what is real and actual. They observe and remember specifics, and they trust their experience. Whereas people who have a preference for intuition focus on the patterns and meanings in data. They remember specifics when they relate to a pattern, and they trust their inspiration. Continued again, people who have a preference for sensing build carefully and thoroughly toward their conclusions and understand ideas and theories through practical applications. Very practical frame of mind, folks. And people who have a preference for intuition then move quickly to conclusions and follow their hunches or follow their gut, and they want to clarify ideas and theories before putting them into practice. So based off of those two descriptions, pick a letter that best represents you, S or N. Okay. Angie had asked a question about seeing responses. We'll share everybody's, well, if you feel comfortable sharing your type once we have all 4 letters, I'll ask you to put that in the chat, but you don't have to do that right now. Next, how people make decisions. People have a preference for thinking, step back and out of a situation to get an objective view of everything that's going on. I want to analyze things, use cause and effect reasoning, and solve problems with logic. Whereas people who have a preference for feeling step in to identify with everyone involved so that they can make decisions that best honor people. In that way, they're more empathetic, guided by their own personal or social values, and they assess the impacts of decisions on people. People who have a preference for thinking strive for an objective standard of truth. They're reasonable, they can be tough-minded, but they're fair. They want everyone treated equally. People who have a preference for feeling, on the other hand, strive for understanding, harmony, and positive interactions. They are compassionate, and sometimes on the extreme may appear too tender-hearted. But they are also fair, but they want everyone treated as an individual. Based off of those descriptions, write the letter that best represents you, T or F, thinking or feeling. And finally, how people approach the outside world. That's done through a preference for judging, J, or perceiving, P. People who have a preference for judging are scheduled. They organize their lives. They are systematic and methodical. While people who have a preference for perceiving are often spontaneous, flexible, casual, and open-ended. Further, people who have a preference for judging make short-term and long-term plans. They like to have things decided. They like to come to closure on things and move on because they try to avoid last-minute stress. People who have a preference for perceiving are ready to adapt and change course at a moment's notice. They like to keep things loose and, again, are open to change. And they find last-minute pressures energizing. Based off of those two descriptions, which would you say, J or P? All right, by now you should have all four letters. And so if you feel comfortable, feel free to share your feel free to share your four letters in the chat box. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. Okay. I've seen quite a few come in, and so I've been tracking them as we've gone along. I'll start reading through some of our different characteristics associated with each type, and then we'll jump into some activities here. So I haven't seen an ISTJ come up, but if ISTJ is you and I don't read it, just give me a quick shout out in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that I read your characteristics. So I'll just go with the ones that I have a type for accounted for. So starting with ISFJs. ISFJs are quiet, friendly, responsible, and conscientious. They are committed and steady in meeting their obligations. They are thorough, painstaking, and accurate. They are loyal and considerate. They notice and remember specifics about people who are important to them, and they're concerned with how others feel. They strive to create an orderly and harmonious environment at work and at home. INFJs seek meaning and connection in ideas, relationships, and material possessions. They want to understand what motivates people and are insightful about others. They're conscientious and committed to their firm values. They develop a clear vision about how best to serve the common good. They're organized and decisive in implementing their vision. INTJ have original minds and great drive for implementing their ideas and achieving their goals. They quickly see patterns in external events and develop long-range explanatory perspectives. When they're committed, they organize a job and carry it through. They're skeptical and independent and have high standards of competence and performance for themselves and for others. Next one is ISTP. I don't have any ISTPs that I know of as I scroll through the rest of the chat. So we'll skip that one, but if I've missed you, we'll come back. ISFP, again, we don't have any that have reported. INFPs. INFPs are idealistic, loyal to their values and to the people who are important to them. They want an external life that is congruent with their values. They are curious, quick to see possibilities, and can be catalysts for implementing ideas. They seek to understand people and to help them fulfill their potential. They are adaptable, flexible, and accepting unless a value is threatened. INTP, again, we don't have any of those here that have reported. ESTP. ESTPs are flexible and tolerant. They take a pragmatic approach focused on immediate results. Theories and conceptual explanations bore them. They want to act energetically to solve problems. They focus on the here and now, they're spontaneous, and they enjoy each moment that they can be active with others. They enjoy material comforts and style and learn best through doing. ESFP, none have been reported. ENFPs, welcome to the club. ENFPs are warmly enthusiastic and imaginative. They see life as full of possibilities. They make connections between events and information very quickly and confidently proceed based on the patterns that they see. They want a lot of affirmation from others and readily give their own appreciation and support. They're spontaneous and flexible and often rely on their ability to improvise and their verbal fluency. ENTPs, I haven't seen. Okay, we did have one come in. So ENTPs are quick, ingenious, stimulating, alert, and outspoken. They're resourceful in solving new and challenging problems. They're adept at generating conceptual possibilities and then analyzing them strategically. They're good at reading other people. They're bored by routine and will seldom do the same thing the same way. They're apt to turn to one new interest after another. ESTJs are practical, realistic, matter-of-fact. They're decisive, and they quickly move to implement decisions. They organize projects and people to get things done. They focus on getting results in the most efficient way possible. They take care of routine details. They have a clear set of logical standards and systematically follow them and want others to also. They can be forceful in implementing their plans. No ESFJs have reported, I don't believe, but again, if I miss you, I'll come back. ENFJs are warm, empathetic, responsive, and responsible. They're highly attuned to the emotions, needs, and motivations of others. They find potential in everyone and want to help others fulfill that potential. They can act as catalysts for individual and group growth. They're loyal, responsive to praise and criticism. They're sociable and facilitate others in a group and provide inspiring leadership. And then ENTJs. ENTJs are frank, decisive, and they assume leadership readily. They quickly see illogical and inefficient procedures and policies and develop and implement procedures and policies that, I lost my words here. They quickly see illogical and inefficient procedures and policies and develop and implement comprehensive systems to solve organizational problems. They enjoy long-term planning and goal setting. They're usually well-informed, well-read, and enjoy expanding their knowledge and passing it on to others. They can be forceful in presenting their ideas. So that's a quick run-through of everybody who's reported so far. If I've missed your 4 letters, feel free to send us a chat or put something in the Q&A. And I can go back, but otherwise we'll jump into our activities. Let's see. Okay, we got something for ESFPs. ESFPs are outgoing, friendly, and accepting. They're exuberant lovers of life, people, and material comforts. They enjoy working with others to make things happen. They bring common sense and a realistic approach to their work and make work fun. Flexible and spontaneous, and they adapt readily to new people and environments. They learn best by trying a new skill with other people. All right. So one of the big activities that we do uh, with our students, with other folks that I've done presentations for. The first activity that we use to show the personality differences between people who have a preference for extroversion and introversion is an activity where we ask them to draw their ideal room. And so now in front of you, you should see this empty whiteboard. And so I'm just going to walk you through a couple of the things that usually pop up on that because it's always humorous. This is for college students and working professionals. So in an extroverted room, we have this entire whiteboard. And so extroverts will take a poster-sized white sheet of paper, not draw any walls, and then just start drawing the things that come into mind for their room. And so I usually tell people that we're not artists here. Some people are, but I am not. So if you want to just draw me a blueprint and write what things are, that's completely fine. And so I'll draw just a few things here. So we'll try to label this as best we can here. So extroverts usually start by getting all the entertainment things out of the way first. And so, you know, we got to have a big bar, a big TV. You know, we got to make sure that we have our couch with all of the seating, but it's like really theater style seating, and so all of our friends can come in and do this thing. We got a big old dance floor. We got speakers on every corner of the dance floor. Like things are crazy in the extroverted room. There's so much things going on. The things that you can't see in the drawing, there's an aquarium in the floor, but it's filled with sharks. There's a disco ball up overhead. The list goes on and on. Now, if we show this kind of room to introverted folks, there's a lot of things that they have thoughts about. The first is, if you look very carefully, thinking about an ideal room, there's something that's key that's missing, the door. Extroverts almost always forget doors, windows. Sometimes they even forget food, although sometimes they're known to throw in the occasional full-time live-in chef that prepares everybody's meals. But their big emphasis is having something, some sort of social space for the people that are coming into their space. And so that's kind of the big thing there. Often there's a water element. Most of our college students will draw a bed with a water slide right next to it that goes down into the hot tub on the first floor. The list, again, goes on and on. But if you look at an introverted room, they almost always well define their space. And so this is the room with all of the walls. They've got like beautiful like French doors that open and revolve and do all sorts of cool, crazy things. But it's a well-defined door that tells everybody where they can go to get the heck out of their space. There's private seating, like a little reading nook. This is a very poor drawing, and I'm sorry for any of our introverted friends who are in the call. There's almost always a cat or a dog. Dogs are known to be more extroverted animals, cats introverted animals, but you can have kind of the best of both worlds. Everything is just well-defined space. If they've got a bed or a couch, it's you know, 2 seats, 2 pillows, walk-in closets. Everything is neat, organized in its own space, and that's usually what we see. And so, let me get rid of all of our drawings here. Oh, there we go. So again, when we see the differences between the two types in that kind of an activity situation, but also in work situations, people who have a preference for extroversion are usually talking more. They're showing more energy and enthusiasm. Sometimes they're quick to interrupt each other or talk over one another. They'll respond immediately to a question. and usually provide more nonverbal information, gestures, talking with their hand. If my camera was on, you'd see me doing almost all of that, and so thank God that's not on. But people with a preference for introversion, on the other hand, need time to process, and so they'll reflect before responding to certain questions. They reflect more, they're quieter, and their enthusiasm is usually more internal. They always wait for space to contribute their ideas. They they don't have a preference for interrupting others, and so they'll wait for their turn to speak. And they're more contained, harder to read. Again, reactions happen more internal. And so the observable differences you notice between the opposite preferences, are just that. I think about my own working relationship with my colleague Jenny Sandberg, who's also in a lab working in the Wackerly Center. And so when we first started working together, Jenny has a preference for introversion, while mine is extroversion. And so I am the guy everybody loves to hate because I'm the person who shows up at your office door to ask you a quick question that takes more than just a few seconds. I want to process out ideas and things like that, but sometimes my colleagues around me need time to process and will be quick to show me the door at times. But now that we've worked together a few years, I can just sit down and start spitting out ideas. Jenny is a great brainstorming buddy. The implications, though, and the application of this for your own interactions. If you look back on some of your working relationships or even relationships at home, what kind of communication challenges do the differences here present? And have your misunderstandings with people with opposite preferences kind of come up, but maybe you just didn't have a way to explain it before. And so again, if we use my example with Jenny and I, the interaction at work, right? I needed to learn how to pump the brakes a little bit. I have a lot of enthusiasm about ideas, which I'll expand on a little later. But how do you use all of that time together, honor requests and arrangements, but how do you make sure that you make room for other folks in the space that you are in? Different things like that. Okay, another quicker activity this time. To understand sensing and intuition, we need to look at the ways in which we take in information. So I'm going to throw up an image on the screen. I'll give you about 5 or 10 seconds to study it. And then I want you to come up with a list on that same sheet of paper and just think about the things that you see from the image. So here we go. 10 seconds starting now. Okay, so take a little bit, think about, write a list about what you saw. So when we look at this image, there is a lot going on. I usually get very verbal groans when I take out the image because people are looking at it so intently. But when we look at the differences between the preferences here, sensing and intuition, people who have more of a preference for sensing, when I ask, what do you see? You're more likely to give me a list of things that you actually see. Remember, using those 5 senses, that's how you're taking in your information. And so when I ask people, what do you see? They'll tell me they see a boat in the bottom right-hand corner. They see birds up ahead. There's clouds, there's a hand, there's weird shapes, there's pages opening up, there's a man looking over a field, different things like that. If I ask people who have a preference for intuition, what do you see when you look at this image? They'll tell me a story about creationism or some sort of religious, thing. There's God's hand. Is he controlling the man down at the bottom? Is this someone's imagination? Trying to make a story out of the information that's being taken in. And so when we say that people with a preference for intuition have a preference for taking large groupings of data to form a pattern, so that's kind of what we're talking about here. We create a story about the information that we're taking in, whereas people who have a preference for sensing take in information that they perceive that's practical, matter of fact, things that they can take in with their senses. And so again, focusing people with a preference for sensing focus on the physical attributes. People who have a preference for intuition looking at the conceptual meanings. So there's differences between sensing and intuition. If we think about that in a work setting, again, I don't mean to pick on Jenny because I don't think she's in our webinar today, so my apologies to Jenny in advance. But when Jenny and I work on projects together, I am the, maybe the person you love to hate because I'm always generating ideas, but not thinking of the logistical background for it initially. I'll get there. I promise I'll get there. I see that my boss is on the call, and so I promise I do get there. But that's not my first instinct. I am the possibilities, the head in the clouds kind of thing, and people who have a preference for sensing are our stakes in the ground to make sure that we don't lose sight of what is actually achievable. And so those are the kind of differences there. But then we think about feeling and thinking. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this activity. But what we see when it comes to making decisions, if you remember from the description earlier, people who have a preference for thinking step out of a situation to get an objective view of things that are going on. People who have a preference for feeling step into that situation to identify with everybody who's involved. And so looking at the major differences, people who have a preference for thinking more likely rely on their logic and rationalize the situations based on facts that they've taken in. Sometimes they can be seen as harsh because of their adherence to policies, procedures, rules. People who have a preference for feeling, on the other hand, rely first on their personal values, morals to make decisions. And they can be seen as too nice because of their desire to put feelings and other people before the policies and procedures. And so those major differences, again, is if you're looking at a situation, a lot of things going on with COVID-19. My wife is dealing with possible layoffs at the company that she works at, and so if we're thinking about it from a perspective of budget cuts, right? People who have a preference for feeling are going to do everything possible. They're going to stop paper supplying the company, anything that they can do to protect people. Whereas people who have a strong preference for thinking, maybe on the extreme side of thinking, see the easiest way to make decisions is by including people as part of the cut, right? And so those are the sort of differences that we see pop up in terms of thinking and feeling. And then judging and perceiving, when we think about work and we think about play, people who have a preference for judging typically are the folks who have to get the work done before they can do anything we would consider to be play, right? But perceivers, on the other hand, are more likely to play anytime, regardless of the work that they have in front of them. If we go back to our whiteboard example, Let me delete my beautiful drawing here. People who have a preference for judging are likely to have a very strict timeline that they're adhering to, with incremental things getting done here and here until boom, project's completed. But people who have a preference for perceiving, on the other hand, if this is job completion, they're more likely to start initially, but then take a significant amount of detours. Things are getting a little dicey. They take a break because some really hit show on Netflix just came out. They need to connect with family or do different things. They maybe need to go back and brainstorm. Things are just out of control, craziness. They are doing their own thing, and then right at the last minute, boom, the project gets done. And that's maybe a look inside my own head, but that's definitely what perceivers do. When we say that perceivers have a preference for last minute pressures because that work energizes them, perceivers are often labeled as procrastinators, but we just do our best work when we have some sort of soul crushing deadline. And so that is our major difference between the two types there. So people with a preference for perceiving definitely stress out the folks who have maybe more of a preference for judging because they have to rely on others' input before finishing their part. They really enjoy finishing those projects early and do their best work when they have control over their schedule. Perceivers also do their best work when they have control over their schedule, but we don't have a fixed timeline, and so we can throw everybody into chaos. And so the implications and applications of that personality difference, judging and perceiving types always have a plan, but they frustrate each other with the way they develop and implement their plans. So not so much a problem with the person, but a problem with the how we're trying to do things. And so it's important for people who have a preference for judging and perceiving to negotiate the things that that are decided and where there might be flexibility. And I know for myself as a perceiver, we needed to negotiate checkpoints and how to deal with mid-course corrections. Now moving online, that's even more important for the work that we do together, right? Is how do we make sure that the work's still getting done? There's kind of checkpoints in place for major projects that we're working on. So hopefully all of those different things make sense. And so the important piece here is now that you have an understanding of your own kind of personality preferences and the things that make up each dichotomy, it's important that we just have an awareness of those differences, right? How we're interacting with other folks at work, at home, and acknowledging the value that other folks who have a personality preference that's different from ours and what they bring. I work with a lot of sensors. I work with a lot of people who have a preference for judging, and they keep me honest, right? They make me they make me articulate my plans in a stronger, more efficient way. That's not just conceptual babblings of a man in chaos over here, and so different things like that, right? So valuing the team that's around you and what everybody's bringing to the table. But also practicing new behaviors, seeking out others who are different from you, the different kind of personality types that people bring to any relationship, again, very, very strong. And then obviously making sure incorporating those different perspectives into your daily interactions, right? Very important stuff. And so now that you have a basic understanding of your personality preferences and that of others, hopefully you've been able to picture someone that you work with in your mind. So thinking about those interactions, what might you keep doing that works? What might you do differently? In this crazy environment, how and when might you do it? And when and how might you check to see if you're on track? And how might you check in with those folks? So those will give you some time for some reflection to those questions, but the next piece is open for your questions, and I'll try to provide some answers as we wrap up here.
Jake, I see a question from Zach Edmonds. It's,
okay.
I tested one way, but after further explanation, I think it's different. Is that common?
Yeah, so again, one of the things that is one of the things that comes out of this when we do this in this way, when we do the quote-unquote free version of this, is you have a preference for one over the other. If you take the actual assessment, they make you make a variety of forced choices that give you kind of a preference clarity index, which doesn't measure how much of a personality type you are, but how, like, where your preference lies, right? And so we might have a preference for, say, extroversion or introversion or judging and perceiving, right? Judging and perceiving is pretty easy. So when I went through my certification course, my type was an ENFJ. But I am very clearly an ENFP, and my instructor pointed that out every day of the certification because I would walk in just as he was starting, and I was always the last one to do something, and so he caught me one day and said, "There's no way that you are a J. You're definitely a P." But upon further examination, I like having a schedule and being planned, like having my own outline of a plan, but I'm also very casual and open-ended, and adaptability is like one of my like preferred like working environments, right? And so that outweighs all of the things I value about the judging kind of preference. And so that's sometimes how those things pop up. If you tested one way by taking the assessment, but you get something else, it all depends on how you took the assessment, right? So those are a couple of different answers there. Hopefully that answers your question, Zach. I see another question from Dennis about getting the like a full Myers-Briggs profile. And so if you ever want to do a independent assessment of your own personality preferences, I think that we could set that up if you email wackerly@monmouthcollege.edu. We can get you in touch with the full assessment to take through the service we have at the college. So another question from Kurt here. So if you had to make a decision and had a hard time choosing between two traits, is it possible to switch or have different types depending on the situation or task? I think absolutely. Again, these are just your preferences, and so depending on your environment, you have different preferences for how you approach different situations. And so so my inborn preference is perceiving, but because I need to have a job and get work done, I had to develop more of the judging preference to be scheduled, systematic, make sure I'm replying to my bosses, my students' emails in a timely fashion, right? All of those things. And so those are the different ways that those kind of pop up. Extroversion and introversion is an interesting one because we like to think that we are sociable. And so there are a lot of, we hear people who are extroverted introverts. They like to be sociable with other people, but that doesn't mean that introverts are necessarily, or they're non-social. They're social with the people who they are close with, that they trust, that they have good connection to. Extroverts are just like all over the map. Like they'll talk to literally anybody that they meet on the extreme side, right? And so those are the kind of differences to pay attention to as we go. Any other questions popping up for anybody? Oh, Zach asked about the real colors. True Colors is an assessment we've done here at the college before as well. If you're not familiar, like the MBTI, it gives you personality assessments based off of a color. If anybody's ever taken it before, I'm a blue and gold, and so there's different traits that are associated with those. We use those at the college as well. I like the MBTI a little bit more just because there's a lot of different ways to go in depth with MBTI profiles. And so in a fuller, more expansive version of this, we would talk about how you approach communication challenges at work, how you approach conflict with each type, different things like that. And so there's just a little bit more of an advantage diving in really deep to MBTI related things. And Dennis brought up the DISC assessment. I would say the same thing there. DISC is really associated, if I'm not mistaken, with the situational leadership model. And so there's just, while DISC has its advantages, certainly, when we're talking about personality assessment and teamwork, I really value MBTI. And it's not because I'm certified. I value all of them, but MBTI is my preference. Yeah, Mary Beth asked a question about groups that have suggested taking MBTI through 16 personalities. How does it compare to the true MBTI? Again, I think from my perspective and what I can see on the MBTI assessments that people take, there's the informality of some, like they just don't go into a certain depth. So from an organizational perspective, if you wanted to talk MBTI, I could talk about type and organizational change. I could talk about type and communication challenges again, diversity issues and personality type. We could go, the list goes on and on about all of the type and kind of things that we could do through the true MBTI. And so that's kind of, again, why I have the preference, the stronger preference for MBTI. I've got another question from, the question says, there are times where I absolutely cannot make up my mind and will insist that someone else makes a decision for me. And so I don't have a preference for what is selected or advised. Is that unusual? I would say the answer to that is no. Sometimes, especially if we're in a situation where, let's say you've been making decisions all day, that's the strain on the function pair of sensing and intuition or feeling and thinking. And so if you've had to make decisions all day, or there's just too much information to be weighed, then that's where the indifference about what is selected comes from. Sometimes if it's just little things that maybe are just too small, like small potatoes, from what else you have to make decisions on, that is another instance in which that just indifference comes through. And then Dennis is asking, what are some of the breakthroughs we've seen from people who experience MBTI? I think one of the coolest ones, for me, I coordinate the West Central Leadership Program here in Monmouth, their personality session for the leadership class we do. And so a couple of years ago, I had someone come through and they took the assessment. They worked for a small organization in town, but they had a lot of frustration around some of the folks that they worked with. And so after our personality session, she called me a few times and said, I want to talk through some of these challenges I'm having as it relates to my type, because I never believed in any of this stuff before. I thought this was all just a bunch of like BS. But you said things in that session that opened my eyes to how I can address these different challenges, right? And so when we think about personality assessment, some people are kind of quick to dismiss them. And even some folks are quick to dismiss MBTI. And so being able to kind of see how people relate to the information and really have kind of an awakening about themselves and how they can solve the challenges that they're facing. It's really cool for me as the MBTI facilitator. Well, that makes up all of the time that we have. If you have any other questions or you want to talk a little bit more, feel free to stay connected with me. There's my email, LinkedIn, everything. You can give us a call. I think, again, I'll say wackerly@monmouthcollege.edu if you ever want to talk more about MBTI as well. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope everybody's staying well and being safe.
Thank you so much, Jake. I'll clap for the whole group. I think that was a great presentation. And thank you all for joining us today. Please fill out the short pop-up survey giving feedback on today's webinar. And you can also share suggestions for future Tartan Talks topics or presenters in that survey as well. Our next Tartan Talk is slated for May, so be on the lookout for more information for that. And stay healthy and go Scott!